Excellent. Welcome to our, as it happens, last seminar of this series, because next week has been cancelled, sadly. But what an ending to our seminar series, because we've got a great lineup of speakers today to talk to us about Serbia and Hungary and illiberalism and democratic resistance to liberalism. Now, the idea started obviously by protests in Serbia that we've been observing, all of us, with some hope in us as well, during last year, lasting up until now occasionally. And we really wanted to see what kind of resistance it is to illiberal systems in Serbia, but also compare with Hungary. Hungary has been compared to Serbia a lot, but also Hungary as often described as an outlier in Europe. And what best to have today with us than our three speakers that know political matters in those countries very, very well. And starting from my left, Zoltán Ádám, who is a senior research fellow at the Center for Social Sciences in Budapest. Currently, he's a fellow at the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin. He has a political economy background and currently working on a project which is about Orban, the EU's only electoral autocracy in a comparative perspective. Zoltán will start, and then he will be followed by Gordy, who is a professor of political and cultural sociology at the School of Slavonic and East European Studies at UCL in London. And we have worked with Eric in the past, and we are very happy that he's here again. A couple of his books that are very well known on Serbia include The Culture of Power in Serbia, Nationalism and Destruction of Alternatives, one, and another one on Guilt, Responsibility and Denial, The Past at Stake in Post-Milosevic Serbia. And then, as our discussant today, and the person that we co-organize this together as a SEESOX joint venture, is Jessie Hronešová, who is a lecturer in political sociology at UCL, at School of Slavonic and East European Studies, but also Jessie, a very good friend, a colleague, and an associate, long associate of SEESOX as well. Her book is about the struggle for redress, victim capital in Bosnia and Herzegovina, a country that she knows really very well, and with also practical experience in international organizations. Now, Zoltán will start with 20 minutes, Eric with another 20 minutes, and Jessie with 10. And then from what I see here, we're going to have a very good discussion with your comments and questions, mostly questions. Okay, Zoltán, over to you.
Okay, thanks a lot. If you don't mind, I might stand up.
Yes, absolutely.
So, and may actually step over there. Thanks a lot. So I wrote this presentation, and I hope I'm not going to be too long. And thanks a lot for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here, of course. So I was thinking about what kind of presentation I should bring here, and I decided that I will try to put together three things in this presentation. First, I will speak a little bit of the Orban regime itself as I see it. Secondly, I will say a few words about the opposition, the old and new opposition, as it is called in Hungary. The new seems to having a chance of defeating Orban actually next April. And thirdly, because this is about popular resistance to illiberalism, I will try to discuss a little bit what kind of political mobilization traditions exist in Hungary and what kind of relations among them can be detected and what kind of role they may play in political changes in the forthcoming period and what they did in the past 15 years of the Orban regime. So first, So at the beginning was 2006, which is not, of course, not the Orbán regime. It is the last election for the Orbán regime, 2006. This is Prime Minister Gyurcsány, who was re-elected in 2006. Actually, it was the first time a post-1989, 1990 Prime Minister was re-elected at elections in Hungary. But it was a quite a costly re-election, I would say. So there was heavy pre-election spending, fiscal expansion, which was sort of a custom. So in Hungary, traditionally, there's a pretty large fluctuation of political fiscal cycle, so to speak. So governments tend to spend a lot before elections, sort of buying the votes. Prime Minister Gyurcsány and his socialist liberal coalition, center-left coalition, did so. And after election, this is part of the cycle, there's a fiscal restriction. So there was a fiscal stabilization process in which already a few months after election, there was a public disappointment with the government. And at the top of that came this so-called speech in which the prime minister was persuading his own socialist parliamentary faction of the need of fiscal stabilization. And that speech was leaked in September of that year, in the autumn of that year. And street riots actually started in Budapest for the first time since 1956. And this is the moment when the center left, which traditionally stood for liberal democracy as such, much more than the center right, I would argue, lost a large part of its credibility. So the next important date I decided to picture is 2010, when Prime Minister Viktor Orbán takes over. Very important that this is a two-third constitutional majority with which he wins the election. But so Fidesz itself, his political party, although it receives 53% of the total vote, it because of the majoritarian nature of the Hungarian electoral system, receives two-thirds of parliamentary seats, and with two-thirds you can do anything. It means that basically is the end of the system of checks and balances, because the very institutions that constitute the checks and balances are controlled by the government itself. And this is the regime, it's called the system of national cooperation, established back in 2010 by Orbán and his Fidesz party. Within the EU, that's important. So that's an elected, democratically legitimized autocracy in the EU, which means that the EU still constitutes a constraint on the regime. So internal checks and balances, not so much, but the EU does exercise important influence constraining the regime. And it's, of course, it's an interesting question at what point Orbán would decide to leave the EU. We can discuss it in the Q&A if you are interested. I guess in a Serbian comparison might be interesting to say a few words about it. Sorry. So what kind of regime is that? This is a sort of shameless promotion of my own research. Sorry for that. It can be called a patrimonial information autocracy, patrimonial in the Weberian sense. Instead of impersonal rule of institutions, it becomes the rule of persons and their kins. And it's information autocracy in the sense of Guriev and Treisman, who argue that some autocracies today are not operating on the basis of physical oppression, but basically by manipulating public perceptions. And this to a large extent applies to Hungary, and this research I with a colleague tried to elaborate on that. So this was about the regime. And let's say a few words about the opposition to the regime. First, to the sort of professional political opposition. So this is just a very simple table of electoral performance of major political parties in Hungary. As you can see, Fidesz dominates the political landscape since 2010. There's a degree of fluctuation of the Fidesz vote, but it hovers around 50%. Back in 2010, it's 53. In 2022, it's even more, 24. all the first 4 columns are general elections. So these are parliamentary elections in Hungary, the 4-year intervals. And of course, the next one is coming up next spring, 2026. But the most recent, the last column is the most recent EU parliamentary election, at which you can, actually in the last 2 columns already, you can observe a sort of reconfiguration of opposition parties. So back in 2022, the opposition, including the socialists who are in the second the second row, and Jobbik, which is the old far-right party, realized back in 2018 that because of their division, they have no chance of overtaking Fidesz. So in 2022, they decided to come together to join forces, and there, along with 4 other parties, to be correct. And this 6-party alliance received 34% of the vote back in 2022, which is actually not such a bad electoral result, in my personal opinion. I mean, the fiscal spending, the war in Ukraine going on, so the government had ample opportunity to manipulate the electorate. So having 1/3 of the popular vote is not such a particularly bad result, but there was a huge disappointment. So uniting the opposition seemed not to work back in 2022. Our homeland is the new far-right party, which was replacing Jobbik and stays like that. So in 2024, there's yet another new situation. United opposition doesn't seem to be working. So what happens? There's a new political party called TISA, which seems to be capturing the opposition vote. And now, So this guy is the founder of TISA, Mr. Magyar, who is a very interesting character, and actually he had a chance of defeating Orbán next week. So I would emphasize his role, but watch out for him. The super interesting character. On the very first picture up there, he's standing with his wife. This is back in the early 2020s. His wife was minister of justice in Orbán's government up until about 2020, if I'm not mistaken. And very super talented young female politician. We can also discuss this in the Q&A if you want. Female politicians, I think, play important role in this machoistic autocratic regime. So she was sort of the human face of the regime, and Péter Magyar was his husband. But they divorced. Officially, they divorced in 2023. They separated a little bit earlier, and when the regime suffers a major blow at the beginning of 2024, there's a scandal of a pedophile case, person who turns out to be a pedophile, educator in a state-run orphanage, receives a pardon, a presidential pardon, and she co-signs it. She co-signs it. And she's in trouble. She has to resign. So Péter Magyar, who up until then was sort of part of the nomenclature, so he filled various kind of mid-level nomenclature positions, comes to the fore and proclaims that he does not anymore serve this regime, and goes to it turns out a very high-profile, important interview in an opposition YouTube channel, and basically establishes his own movement. And this movement receives 30% of the vote at the European parliamentary election. This is his result, and he becomes the leader of the opposition. So here he meets Mr. Orbán in Strasbourg. And so from now on, he's the head of the opposition. You can see the fluctuation of popular support for Hungarian political parties. This is the political poll of polls here, Fidesz is slightly ahead of TISA. That's a methodological issue mainly, which polls you take into consideration and with what way. You can also have, I mean, you see that the old opposition parties are here and here. So this is the period of the united opposition. So this is united opposition here. For a brief period of time at the autumn of 2021, they are paired with Fidesz. Then their support declines. This is the election of 2022. So again, a substantial difference between Fidesz and its opposition. And here again, so the united opposition falls apart. These are the old opposition parties who made it to parliament, but went back to their limited support. And here, this is the start. This is 2024. This is the start of TISA, and TISA rises. And TISA at some point takes over from Fidesz, and now, while their support is sort of similar, most reliable opinion pollsters claim that actually TISA is ahead, and these are the old opposition parties. So just to show you one more slide, so this is one of the most reliable opinion pollsters called Vox Populi, so up here in Hungary, and actually they claim that TISA, which is the green line here, is ahead of Fidesz. That's why we can expect TISA to win. Actually, or at least it has a real chance of winning the election, whereas the old opposition parties are down here. Okay. One important factor I would like to emphasize: the economic conditions. So why the fluctuation, and why is Fidesz in trouble? So here, this is confidence indices, the business confidence index and the consumer confidence index. The consumer confidence index is obviously more directly affecting voters. I mean, they are natural persons voting and having confidence in the business outlook, the economic outlook of the country. And if you see, I started off claiming that there are big fluctuations in fiscal spending, and of course that affect perceptions of the electorate with respect to the economic outlook and their own economic situation, if you like. So those fiscal cycles reflected here in this fluctuation of this red line, which is the consumer confidence index, and the vertical light blue lines are elections. So you see that these lines are sort of going up at elections. Okay, and that's because governments tend to spend more before elections, and after elections they are coming down because there's the period of fiscal stabilization when people get to be disappointed. And here you can see. So this is 2010. Okay, so in 2006. The government managed to push up consumer confidence index up here, and it was re-elected. In 2010, the government was not in the position of pushing up the consumer index. It remained as low as this, and this is the moment where Fidesz gains a two-thirds majority as an opposition party. Here, Fidesz is in power and manages to push up the confidence index to negative 20%. In 2014, that's sufficient to re-elect Fidesz with yet another two-third majority in the altered, by that time, altered electoral system. And in 2018, which brought about that 54% for Fidesz, so actually better than in 2010, the consumer confidence index is up here. Okay? So there's a fluctuation of that, and there's a pretty clear link of this confidence index with electoral outcome for governing and opposition parties, I would argue. 2022 is a difficult situation. This is COVID. This is COVID here, but again, there's a pre-election fiscal spending by the government, and this electoral result is enough for Fidesz to renew its two-third majority once again. But after the election, there's this steep fall. of the index because, again, of fiscal consolidation and the deterioration of the economic situation. Of course, part of that is external, so the global economy is not in a particularly good shape either, but the Hungarian economy is particularly vulnerable. One important factor, EU funds are stopped by this time. Okay? So in 2021, EU funds stopped flowing into Hungary, and this steep flow has to do with that as well. And because the EU doesn't seem to be renewing the flow of EU funds towards Hungary, the government's room of maneuvering is sort of limited. It doesn't mean that there is no fiscal spending. Once again, there is. So hike of pensions, tax breaks, additional fiscal transfers for politically important sections of society are on the agenda once again. But we believe, I personally believe, most observers believe that Fidesz has a much more limited room of maneuvering in terms of economic policy than it had back in 2022, and that is an important factor why Tisza and Péter Magyar may actually win next week. And I guess I should stop talking very soon, so I will not show you all my slides. I just want to say a couple of words about ways of political mobilization in Hungary. So actually, there are at least three types of political mobilization. One is initiated by Fidesz itself, which has, to a large extent, has to do with this 2006 experience of coming out against the lying socialist liberal coalition and rising, symbolically rising, but still rising in arms, symbolically speaking, sort of continuing the 1956 tradition and questioning the legitimacy of the governing socialist liberal coalition. There's an opposition mobilization going on, so anti-Fidesz pro-opposition. And thirdly, and very importantly, I will not have time to discuss this in detail now. We can come back to that in the Q&A if you want. Is a sort of apolitical anti-regime mobilization. And I put here Václav Havel's The Power of the Powerless, which sort of, at least to my mind, but Professor Barton may, of course, know this much better than I do, sort of established this tradition of apolitical political stance. So the Power of the Powerless is about the rejection of the political regime without an ambition to taking over. At least when Havel wrote this, I think I think it's fair to say that this was his idea. He was not organizing a political party; he was organizing a resistance against the regime without the ambition of taking over, but with the ambition of expressing, with the ambition of living in truth, as he himself said, of being identical with yourself and sort of avoiding political influence as much as it was possible. And this is still present in Hungary. This is Fidesz mobilization, and this is opposition mobilization, and this is this kind of apolitical mobilization. So you've got this tradition alive from the beginning of the 2010s. This is a demonstration against an internet tax. Back in 2014, the government planned and actually gave up on it because of this large crowd on the streets of Budapest and other cities. And this is most recently, he's a public figure, Mr. Robert Pusér, who organized a demonstration before Parliament, but without the ambition of forming a political party. So this tradition is still present, and I would argue that it's very important in terms of whether or not it can be channeled into actual opposition, pro-opposition political mobilization. It plays a huge role. And Péter Magyar's Tisza has a good chance of that because although these apolitical crowds have become disappointed with the old opposition that failed in taking over back in 2022, by this time, many ways failed, both individual and collectively. The overwhelming majority of opposition civil society gives the benefit of doubt to Peter Magyar now, and this makes him a plausible contender of the regime. Okay, I guess I should stop here. Oh yeah, this is student movements, also part of this apolitical mobilization, and pride is very important. I just want to say that pride as a tradition plays a prominent role. This is Gergely Karácsony, the Budapest mayor, who successfully organized and made possible to happen the pride, which is banned by Orbán this spring 2025, and turned out to be the largest pride ever held in Budapest. A major defeat for Orbán and a great victory for this kind of apolitical opposition. Okay, I think this is my last slide. So this is comparing crowds. This is October 23. It's of course the day of the 1956 revolution. It happened in October 23. And this is the pro-government crowd. This is the pro-TISA opposition crowd, and there is a sort of a race who mobilizes more successfully. Thank you very much for your.
Thank you very much, Zoltán, for this interesting information. We will come back to many of your points and for keeping the time. Eric, your turn.
I think I'll stand too, because I have a feeling the people in the back can't see if I sit.
Thank you.
So, first of all, hello, good evening. Thanks for inviting me here. It's always a pleasure to come to Oxford. And let me begin by publicizing our new book. This isn't self-serving, you'll see why. It is self-serving, but it's not entirely self-serving. But if you go, those of you who have computers, you can do it now if you like. If you just put into a search engine the phrase "captured societies in Southeast Europe," then you'll get to the publisher's page for the book at Amsterdam University Press. And if you go down that page to the section that is labeled "Open Access," you'll go through a series of clicks, and there you'll have your free electronic copy of the book, which is good for weekends, evening reading at the beach, holidays. Lots of good purposes. I'm not saying this only for the purpose of publicizing the book, although I'm happy to publicize the book, but also for a reason related to what we're going to be saying here. The subtitle of the book is Networks of Trust and Control. And one of the big arguments we're making in the book, we're talking about governance by means of informal networks. And we think that when people are approaching the states and regimes in the region, they're asking the wrong questions about them. They're asking political questions. They're asking questions about ideology and forgetting the basic background facts that you have states that do not function in providing the basic services that states need to provide in a predictable and orderly way. And so people exchange favors, and this is how they get the work of life done, is by exchanging favors. And all of this sounds like a lovely kind of anarchist utopia, if it were not for the fact that these networks through which favors are exchanged are controlled by political parties. So if you want access to employment, education, healthcare, I mean, these are the biggest things, but other things too, you do it through connections to political parties. And this is the way the system works. And that means that when it's time for people to vote, they don't vote for the party that represents their values or ideals. They vote for the party that is most likely to be able to solve the concrete problems they're facing in everyday life. And this is what maintains control. And it does this on the level of citizens of everyday life. And it also does it on the level of more lucrative things like construction contracts, engineering contracts, fields where the state is the largest purchaser. And that's where we get to the protests in Serbia. If I show it to you now, when I was coming up from London on the way outside the window of the bus, we passed by the Grenfell Tower, which is now wrapped with kind of emblem showing respectful memory to the victims of the fire of the Grenfell Tower. This was an incident that kind of became emblematic, at least for a short time, for some people, of everything that was wrong with the system of power and control in this country. Let me give you another example of an incident that came to stand for that. And that was just a bit over a year ago, on the 1st of November of last year, in Novi Sad, which is the second largest city in Serbia, at 12:52, so the time when the station was being used at the principal train station, which had just been reconstructed and ceremonially opened. A concrete canopy covering the path from the platforms to the main station building collapsed. At first, 15 people died in the collapse. Later, another person died. So it was 16, and it was very quickly established that this building was renovated without approval of the design. That the train station was opened without an inspection of the construction. All of these deals were carried out by construction and engineering companies with connections to that were close to the ruling political party. So the party that was in power at the state level and the level of the province of Vojvodina, at the level of the city of Novi Sad, through some pretty backhanded deals. One of the construction companies, the legal owner of the company, it's registered in the name of a 12-year-old boy. So this is one of the ways that people hide their assets. You know this. And protests began immediately. They were led principally by students in Novi Sad, but in other places in Serbia. The protests would always begin with first 15, then when the next victim died, 16 minutes of silence in memory of the victims, and then articulating demands. Now, the demands that the protesters were making, there were four principal demands at the beginning. One is release of all of the information related to the disaster at the train station. Second was prosecution of people who were involved in creating this disaster. The third was, after the regime started sending both police but also private security operated by companies under the influence of the regime, part of their networks, when they started attacking students physically, trying to intimidate them into stopping the protest. They said prosecution of the people who were engaged in these attacks and lifting of charges against students who were charged with criminal offenses for participating in the protests. And the fourth demand was actually met. That was an increase in the budget for higher education. But this starts off as a kind of confrontation. There is an initial attempt to try to disqualify the protesters. What strategies have been used to disqualify the protesters? It was said that these were people trying to separate the province of Vojvodina from Serbia. It was said that they were working for the Croatian secret services. It was said that they were working for the government of Kosovo, for Western intelligence agencies, that these were people who hated the country, who were disrupting order, and so on and so on. I mean, the set of disqualifications became increasingly desperate. And at the same time, the president of Serbia, Aleksandar Vučić, thought, well, let's try making a deal to put an end to the protests. So he invited the students to come for a dialogue, to which the students said, you've seen our demands. None of these things are in the responsibility of the office of the president. And so their answer to him was direct. They said, Nisi nadležan, it is not a part of your job. So how about just meeting the demands and we don't try to make a deal under the table? The protests continued, and I mean, there are really only two responses possible for the regime. One of them was to try to meet the demands, but this is a bit of a trap. There was no way that they could meet the demands without dismantling this whole system of informal networks of control that defines their power. And the other is to engage in more repression. So they engaged in more repression. These protests continued. They've been continuing for over a year. At the time, they were every day. Now they are periodic. But you saw continued physical attacks against people participating in protests and against the students. Threats, particularly to members of university staff who were supportive of the protests. those are continuing. They are trying at Novi Sad now to fire a person instead of promoting her to full professor, who has been a prominent supporter of the protests at the university in Niš, where the faculty of philosophy has been a principal supporter of the protests. They're trying to break off 3 departments from the faculty of philosophy to create a new faculty called Faculty of Serbian Studies that would be staffed by loyalists. And there was some direct violence against the protests, probably the high point of which was in March of this year, on March 15th, when the largest protest that had been organized so far, and this I think was at the same time the largest protest in the history of the country, gathered people together in the center of Belgrade. And at one point, you can see this on the video. I say it's not clear what happened. It's clear what happened, but it's not established through documentation. You can see at one point there are large crowds in the street around this the corner that strangely enough is known by the name of London. But at one point you could just see suddenly this whole intersection clearing out. People are running away. And it's not entirely clear what happened, but what most people believe happened is, have you heard of sound cannons before? Yes. It's apparently they're used for a lot of things, and also for crowd control. It's a device. It looks a bit like one of those old PA speakers that emits a high intensity sound wave that is apparently just intolerable for people who are within its path. So the belief is that this weapon was used against the demonstrators by the police or possibly somebody else on March 15th. I mean, the regime denies it. We don't have this established in anything like a court decision or a finding or a document, but I'm just going to come out and say that's what happened. You've seen this similar sort of thing. Now, one of the things that this means is that the protests have moved away from the 4 demands that initially motivated them last November and have become a protest for 2 things in particular. One is a protest against police and para-police violence, and the other is a demand for the calling of early elections in which the government could be replaced. Now, I want to say a little bit about the possibility of these early elections and what could happen there. In my view, it's really a gamble to call for elections in a state where you have a regime in power that has a long and distinguished record of committing electoral fraud of different types. Okay, so the chances are not good, and we've already seen some fraud probably in some local special elections that have been held in the meantime. But the other thing about these elections is here is the idea on the side of the protesters, and that is most of the opposition parties have said that they will stand back in favor of an electoral list that everybody is calling the student list. So a list of candidates that would be assembled by the student plannings at the various universities. And if you want to go by survey findings, but I think be suspicious of survey findings here, there's an indication that a pretty large majority would vote in favor of the student list. I mean, at the height of sympathy for the protests in February of this year, you have over 70% of people saying that they supported the students. So this is, I mean, if over 70% of people say yes to a question, this is the kind of finding that you only get if the question is, do you like chocolate and puffins, right? I mean, it just doesn't happen. But there's a catch. First catch. The protest is led by student groups, but the regime has formed its own student group, which first they called Students 2.0, and then they called the Students Who Wanted to Study. This group was sort of the spearhead in setting up this tent encampment in the park that stands in between the building of the state presidency and the building of the parliament in the center of the city of Belgrade. They've taken over this park, so for the last year, you can't take your kids to the park or walk your dog or anything because it's filled with armed people in tents who originally said they were students, but I'm sure there has not been a student in that park for a very long time. These are basically, how should I put this politely, big thugs. So So there is, I mean, the presence of this encampment is there as an ongoing threat that if anything happens that could threaten the existing power, there will be violence in the streets. It's a promise of violence in the streets. The other thing that will happen is suppose the students do come forward with their student list to oppose the governing party in an election. This is the strategy that the regime takes with this sort of thing. They will form a whole bunch of alternative student lists. So there will be the student list, the list of the students who want to study, the list of the students who want to go for coffee, and so on, trying to dilute the support for their opposition. But there is another point here too, because I already said we're talking about a group that, at least according to surveys from earlier this year, has over 70% support. This means a very, very broad coalition is coming out in favor of the students. And here's the thing about a very broad coalition. Broad coalitions contain in them people who you would like to see have more influence in public life. And they also contain the other kind of people. So there is some real contestation about what political group and what political tendency will have control in this student-led movement. And I think part of this could be competition between the student plenums at different faculties. So philosophy, dramatic arts, and political science are very much into the democratic side. Philology, law, and of course theology are putting forward some people as speakers at the protests and so on who are pretty fash people you would not be inclined to support. And if they become prominent in the student list, then pretty much everybody that I know will not support the student list. Now, the other thing that is happening from the beginning when they started demanding elections, there was the implicit promise that a student list-led government that was elected would be a government with a set term of existence, 12 or 18 months, and with a specific job to create the conditions for free and fair elections to be held to succeed them. And this sounds like a very good idea. But can you think of examples before of governments that have stuck to time limits that they have set for themselves? They're very rare if there are any. And also, these promises are not a part of any written or published program. People believe that they will do this, but there will certainly be people who don't have any reason to believe that they will do this. And then you will probably see the kind of opportunistic behavior that people engage in when they occupy positions of power, especially for the first time. What can I say? The last time that I was in Serbia to observe things directly was in July. And this was a time when the police forces were displaying their power very aggressively, and it looked like the protests had quieted down. They revived more, I think, when the behavior of the police started exceeding some implicitly understood boundaries. So they're very much alive again. The anniversary of the disaster at the beginning of this month was a moment for them to become more alive. I expect that what I'll see when I go again in a couple of weeks is this very polarized environment with a lot of encouragements to silence that people may or may not resist. But I can say this, that one consequence of the protests has been that the legitimacy and acceptability of the regime in power have been broken. They simply do not have it. What I do not know and can't say is whether this will have any consequences, because I think we all know that regimes can last a long time without public acceptance and without legitimacy when they control a lot of things, especially the use of force. So maybe I'll try to end it now on that happy note and say there are a lot of other things that we could discuss, and I'm very, very happy to try to address anything you might want to raise in the discussion. And if anybody thinks that I have been terribly wrong or tendentious about anything, you are entirely welcome to say so, and we'll talk. Thanks for your time and patience.
Thank you very much, Eric. Another excellent presentation on the students in Serbia. Jessie.
Thank you so much, and thanks for these brilliant presentations. So as a discussant, my role is usually to bring some similarities and differences to the table and try to probably provide a broader picture about these two cases, because we have a comparative panel. So I will try to do exactly that. So just to set the scene for my comments, and Zoltán already said that in the beginning, both Serbia and Hungary operate within what political scientists would usually call this political hybridity of electoral autocracies or competitive authoritarian regimes. There's a variety of names how we could call it. I think in our panel we also use the term illiberalism. But basically, it's states where democratic rituals such as elections exist, but governance is shaped by state capture that Eric mentioned and is widely discussed in this new book, but also corruption, institutional packing, lawfare, as we sometimes refer to in Hungary in terms of the stream of new laws that were adopted in the post 2010 period, and a widespread loyalism to the ruling parties. But within these kind of similarities of electoral autocracies, there's a huge variety of differences in terms of how they operate in practice. And that also then determines what type of resistance can be launched against them. And again, we've seen a variety across the world. In Eastern Europe, we've already explored quite a few in practice. We've seen Poland, we've seen the Czech Republic, we're seeing Bosnia unraveling as well in one way or another. And as well as in these two cases, either, be it kind of united opposition in one way or another, or be it kind of bottom-up grassroots movements. But I would argue that the triggers across the board for most of these resistance movements, or however you want to call them, are rather similar. And I think that's what both speakers also mentioned, which is public discontent with the essentials of democracy, which is delivery of services. And if you haven't, Francis Fukuyama, who sometimes is prissy and sometimes less so, just published a new piece in the Journal of Democracy where he basically focuses most of the attention of right now, the main focus of our democratic research really should be on service delivery, because this is what democracies are not doing right now. They're not delivering services, and this is why elections are lost. So service delivery has been hampered in both of these cases because of large-scale corruption, institutional decay, governance failures, and so on. And so what I'd like to do is I'd like to first highlight some of the differences. This is kind of the wider similarities, but there are some differences in how these regimes operate as well, which have determined the differences in these resistance movements. So firstly, we already heard a little bit about the genealogy of how Orban came to power. And Orban really came to power on the promise of delivering, economic delivery in particular, delivering on clamping down on corruption. It was in the period after the financial crisis. There was also potential kind of support of Russia. There was a meeting that Orban had in 2009 with Putin in Moscow that no one really knows exactly what was discussed, but he seemed to kind of change his trajectory in terms of pro-Russian, anti-Russian feelings. Now, Vučić came to power in a different way. He came to power mainly to stabilize Serbia politically, and also with the high backing of the United States in particular. As a splinter kind of party from the Radical Party, he was a minister of information under Milosevic, as we all know. He was super radical. He famously claimed that for every killed Serb, they would kill 100 Muslims during the wars in the 1990s. But he was brought in to essentially kind of tame the rampant security services and the violent Serbian underworld, if you like, because he was seen as a man of that understands kind of that field and that's this world. But what it also led to is that these kind of trajectories led to the fact that the Hungarian and the Serbian patronage are slightly different. The Hungarian patronage is a lot more formalized through kind of top-down institutionalization of laws, kind of familial networks that Orban's created around himself. He's got his family, his wider family owns pretty much everything, as well as his friends. But he also kind of operates with these kind of highly centralized administrative captures and highly personalized wealth in particular. So let's say that, in Hungary, the patronage is a lot more formalized and a lot more centralized. In the Serbian case, despite obviously the ultimate concentration of power in Alexander Vučić's hands, there is quite a lot of informality, as Eric was already mentioning, which means that the kind of the pool of people is a lot wider. There are sometimes local sheriffs, even in some places, that are essentially kind of working with the party, for the party. But the personalistic patronage is a lot more informal, and it's a lot less kind of institutionalized in laws. And even if it is institutionalized in laws, these laws don't necessarily matter because there's all this informality at the back of it. And I think the third point that is also important for this discussion is this also transpires in how media operates in these two systems. Again, in the Hungarian case, Orbán made sure that he buys out all the media through a kind of this weird company that he establishes, or board that he establishes. Whereas in the Serbian case, despite some of the changes that happened in 2 years, media still operates, at least on paper, in a slightly more kind of pluralistic system. So you still have N1 functioning, you still have kind of a wider variety of media sources, which doesn't necessarily exist in Hungary, where most of them have kind of had to move on the internet. So the Serbian, informality kind of rules, whereas in the Hungarian case, you have a lot more of decentralization, which then obviously makes sense that we then end up with widely different resistance movements, which seem to be gaining some ground. In the more informal and kind of decentralized system, you see this grassroots movement, which is now spread. It's not just students; it's really spread across the country. Whereas in the Hungarian case, really the only potential success must come from a much more kind of centralized, united kind of political front, especially from someone who knows the inner workings of the Fidesz party, the way that Petr Magyar does. I also want to talk really quickly about some similarities. So obviously the first point that I already made is the similarity between why these resistance movements are getting somewhere is that they came at the back of a series of delivery failures, if you like, be it corruption, be it state capture. We've had a series of scandals, both in Hungary as well as in Serbia, especially in the capitals. We've had environmental movements in both states. So obviously both of these kind of movements come at the back of, as we've already seen, a large amount of protest that preceded them. In the Serbian case, in particular, against a project that the European Union has declared of strategic importance for it, which is the Jadran project of lithium mines, the largest, by the way, probably in the world, we think, or definitely in Europe, but one of the largest in the world that are located in Serbia. This is, by the way, one of the reasons why the European Union has been rather silent on the Serbian protests currently. But also, what we've seen is failures in delivery of healthcare, education. The state of Hungarian hospitals is falling, and this is widely known, and this is visible. We've also seen a lot of these scandals that were mentioned by our presenters, especially, the Judit Varga scandal with the pardon, all the rigged elections in 2023, or irregularities that we observed in those elections, as they would like to put it. So this is kind of, why we kind of motivated both of these movements. I think the second one is we can't forget about the wider kind of geopolitical and political context. The European Union plays an important role in both of these cases. As a bank, as a financial kind of source for the Orbán wealth, as well as for a lot of the Vučić projects, if you like, and also Vučić has been seen as this guarantor of stability. So the European Union has been rather complacent with his rule. But it also comes at the back of the fact that we would have probably seen a lot more violence. There's been quite a lot of violence in Serbia, but I think Vučić is tempering his violence quite a lot because he is within this orbit, and at least he's faking or pretending to want to enter into the European Union. I've had a few interviews with senior SNS figures who basically told me that they would not be unhappy if Serbia never joined the European Union, verbatim quote. So make with that what you want, but I don't think there is any kind of rush towards the European Union on the Serbian side. But I think what's also changed is Ukraine. First COVID. We saw the strains of public service delivery that COVID has brought about. That was kind of the first opening of that Pandora box. And then Ukraine comes as a great shock to both of them, to both Orbán as well as to Vučić. And they still won the elections afterwards on this platform of peace and stability, which, by the way, was a copy-paste. I was in Budapest and I was in Belgrade. It was like copy-paste of the same kind of electoral campaign. But ultimately, Ukraine has led to quite a lot of strains in the economy as well for both of them. And I think that will come to the fore in Serbia in particular, because Niš, the company that Gazprom mostly owns and that provides gas in Serbia, has recently been sanctioned. And the strains in the economy are certainly visible from both sides. Both are heavily dependent on Russian energy sources. And if you know anything about the Eastern Europe, is that the moment your rooms at home become cold, people will be very, very angry. And this is why Orbán has kept, he's actually controlled, he's capped energy prices because he's really worried about that. But this is something that will probably come to head, and we should watch out for. And the third point where the similarities lie, and this is again what I think both speakers highlighted, is this broad church resistance. You know, these are movements that have kind of been able to bring together pretty much everyone who just disagrees. And whilst this like anti-Vučić, anti-Orbán kind of electoral strategy can work in the short term, I think my question are mostly around what happens after. We've seen in a lot of other countries that once you rule out a populist autocrat, wannabe autocrat, as I would call them, they might actually be back, and they are back. They've been back in the Czech Republic. They are back. He is back in the Czech Republic. We'll see what happens. Poland, obviously, is another case that everybody's watching. We have a president from that has, so to speak, returned. And so the question really is how successful the anti-populist government would be in that intermediary period. Whether that happens, as Eric is saying, is another question that we have as well. But I think this is really where I think quite a lot of our efforts should be concentrated from my point of view, is once there is that short, brief window of opportunity of having that democratic government, if you like, what needs to happen? How do we improve delivery with very limited and structural kind of constraints on what can be done? How do we increase trust in public institutions? And how do we democracy-proof, as Nick Cheeseman and his co-authors recently said, how do we democracy-proof the institutions that are there so that they're not derailed and taken over in the way that Orbán has done? And the last point I want to make, and I promise I will end there, is that, as something that Eric was saying as well, you know, propaganda in both of these countries had made media headlines. I mean, I'm borderline writing a book about that as well. We're all obsessed about ideology and propaganda. But I think in these semi-open regimes or in these kind of electoral autocracies, propaganda has a limited shelf life. It cannot indefinitely compensate for poor governance and for the lack of delivery. Basically, when delivery falters, the dissonance between official narratives and lived experiences becomes really difficult to conceal, especially in this kind of network world where there still are kind of other sources of information. People have smartphones, etc., etc. Vote buying and, you know, patronage and enforced conformity can only get you as far. I think the moment that, you know, you had a heart attack and you have to sleep in the corridor in a hospital because there's simply not enough beds to accommodate you, which is the case in a lot of hospitals in Hungary. So I think that's where I want to kind of end my comments and hopefully kind of inspire also a discussion about, you know, how do we democracy-proof institutions, even if these elections are obviously less, and even if these elections are successful in the case of Hungary and Serbia, which, by the way, I think in Serbia there's another constraint, which is really, really, really does not want to organize elections between the expo. So much money is being bankrolled on that he will do anything in his power not to organize elections until then.
Thanks to all three of you. I would say quality amazing, but also one of the most disciplined panels that I've ever organized. Because that allows us time for a lot of questions on these extremely interesting ideas that we've heard. So who would like to start with a question? Yes, and identify yourself. Let's get to, and yeah, George, okay.
First of all, thank you for this amazing panel. Just wanted to ask Eric a question, actually. Fantastic, by the way. I'm eager to read your book. Kind of reflecting back on the title of the talk, you know, resistance to illiberalism, right? I was wondering if you think that is the case in Serbia, and of course you mentioned the competitive parties, etc. But I remember asking some of my friends in Serbia who are recent graduates. I think they're quite liberal, proponents of the student list, right? And I asked them, who do you think should replace Vučić? And they said, Nemanja Šarović, right? Who, by the way, was formerly affiliated with the far-right Serbian Radical Party. He burned the NATO flag, etc., etc., etc. Yes. And this kind of made me remember, you know, the discourse around the Bolotnaya protest in Russia, where, you know, we thought that if the protest succeeded, that would be, you know, democratization, liberal democratization in Russia. But then Stephen Whitefield and Paul Chasty from Oxford did a survey of the protesters, and they found out that the majority of them were actually more illiberal than Putin himself, right? So I'm wondering, come back to the beginning, to what extent do you think that these protests are democratic resistance to liberalism? And how do you think this will shape the future, to reflect on Jessie's question?
Okay, so that's one for you, Eric. Yes.
My question is about.
What's your name?
My name's Leo Proctor. I'm a area studies MPhil with St. Anthony's. My question is also for Eric. It's about the threat of competing student lists or potentially competing student lists. I think I heard you say that departments of philology, law, and theology, I hope I heard that right, have advanced names that are objectionable. What sort of candidates? What objectionable positions do they hold, and why those areas of the academy?
Okay. Is there another one, or shall we go? Yes, and Stefan.
Eric talked about electoral integrity in Serbia, and I wonder whether Zoltán could also comment on the integrity of elections in Hungary. We often hear them described as unfair but free, and I wonder whether that epithet really describes the reality of property, whether we're not being too generous when it comes to elections based on what we've seen in the past, and I wonder what their expectations are for 2026. Will they genuinely reflect the free will of the Hungarian?
So let's start with Zoltán first.
Okay, thanks a lot. So the question, should I stand up? I don't know. So the question was about electoral integrity in Hungary. And well, as far as I know, and as far as one can know, I believe, although some other Hungarians might have a different opinion, I think it's true. I think elections were held in an orderly and, well, transparent manner themselves. I mean, propaganda before elections was never fair. It was always used by the government to persuade and manipulate people. And of course, all sorts of pressures might have been placed on opposition candidates, opposition parties. State funding for opposition parties were sometimes revoked. So all sorts of nasty things did happen before elections, and tilting the level playing field always happened. But elections themselves, I mean, the secrecy of the ballot was never systematically breached in Hungary. I mean, we can say there might have been a few cases in which it was breached, but you know, I myself was an observer of the election back in 2022 in a very remote village, which voted 90% for Fidesz, and I didn't find any irregularity. It was not needed. The regime did work so much that there was no need for you know, questioning the integrity of election, and I expect that remains so mostly. I mean, in a more risky situation, the regime might be less risk averse. It can happen, but it's difficult to imagine a scenario in which elections were rigged per se. I mean, it's not part of the tradition of the regime.
I guess I should stand up too.
No, it's okay. We've got a lot of back and forth.
Okay. So let me start with George. And before I answer George's question, I just want to point out that George was our student before he was your student. And you guys got a really good deal from us. But yeah, so fundamentally the question is how liberal is the opposition, and here's what I could say. I mean, if you want to talk about things like promoting understanding and peaceful relations between members of different ethnic and national groups, you've seen some really positive signs. I mean, one of the positive signs has to do with the fact that the protests are very strong in Novi Pazar. Novi Pazar is the capital of the Sanjak region. So this is a region of Serbia with a large population that is Muslim by religion, Boshnak by ethnicity, where people have not always fully accepted identity as being Serbian. You want to draw a parallel to something like Sicilians in Italy or something like that. But the protests have been very strongly supported there, and you've seen a lot of symbolic scenes of unity. People showing together different types of national costumes and flags as an indication of togetherness. You've also seen some veterans for example, addressing the students, there was one really notable address by veterans, who said, "Our lives were ruined because we bought into propaganda from this same group of people that is in power now. And we want to warn you about that." Having said that, numerically, this is probably not the largest group of veterans. And there are other veterans who are a little bit more dubious and nationally inclined. And generally speaking, in terms of these so-called national questions, these ones that are really the ones most inclined to divide people passionately in the country, I think what you'll find is most of the students will say, "These are not our questions. We're here to talk about corruption and the capacity of the state, and we think all of this is just kind of a sideshow to keep people deceived." But there is another more vocal group that takes positions that are really as aggressive as those taken by the regime, which is where we get to Leo's question: who are the objectionable people? Let me talk about just one. This is a person who is frequently mentioned as a potential leader, first name on the student list. He is a professor of comparative literature at the Faculty of Philology, and former student and basically successor of a person who was also in his time the most popular and best loved lecturer at the Faculty of Philology, fellow by the name of Milo Lompar, who is a long-time associate of the regime, was a member of the board of one of the prominent pro-regime propaganda papers, was the person who probably gave the most contentious address at the large protest meeting in June, where he talked about the regime. I mean, basically in terms more extreme than ones that were used in the 1990s. He talked about, the nation and the people as being threatened, including in places where they had not previously been discussed as being threatened, like in Macedonia. So these are the kinds of figures who also have a kind of broad current of support, including among some parts of the students. And I think if that group comes to be dominant on the student list, then these polls of people, if over 50% of people are saying they'll vote for a student list that doesn't exist, that number is bound to go down a bit once it does exist. And some people don't like some of the candidates, and I think it'll go down by a lot if those sorts of people are on it.
Thank you. Jessie, do you want to add something?
I just want to add just to what Zoltán was saying. I think I've heard the phrase in Hungary a lot that the elections are decided not on the election day in Hungary. It's always what happens before that. Orbán has bought the billboard company as far as I'm aware. Like he owns all the billboards, and he kind of stacks the cards and the institutions also in a way, gerrymandering at the likes. So the elections are, and I think that's what the fair kind of stands for. They are free, that there is not the likes that we see in Serbia where people are literally bussed from places. Suddenly an Obstina, suddenly has acquired 300 people and no one knows where they came from, right? So that is not happening in Hungary. But I think what I've heard is that the fair is because of what happens before the elections. I was going to say something else on Serbia, but veterans. I interviewed some of these veterans, and yes, they are not fellows that I would ever want to leave. So I don't think the veteran who spoke at that particular meeting was representative of the wider kind of. Because I think there is a lot of kind of nationalist feeling as well amongst a lot of these groups that which is destroying the country that they fought for, essentially, right? So the resistance can come from different motivations, which have the same kind of focus, which is the delivery, the corruption, infrastructure and the likes.
Very quickly, but what about the manipulation of diasporas by Orban, like giving a very easy vote to the Hungarians, around the borders, and then to those in the West, for instance, much more difficult?
Oh, it has always happened. There has always been large transfers channeled to Hungarian diaspora outside of Hungary in the neighboring countries, particularly in Romania, and to a lesser extent but also importantly in Serbia, Slovakia, and Ukraine. and one can expect that to happen again. And it is actually the least transparent part of the Hungarian electoral system. It has limited capacity of changing the overall vote, but 2-3 members of parliament can be decided by that. And I don't expect that to be more transparent than it was before. Can I say a word about this challenge of non-democracy? I think it's in some sense it's the most important question in any democracy. Of course, democratic elections, non-democrats can participate by rule, and they generate increasing challenges in any democracy of the world, and we can never be safe. I mean, in this country, they will participate in elections, and they can constitute a threat against democracy, I believe. I think one factor that may give us some hope in defense of democracy is to view this picture like democracy is not being a state, it's being a process. And in this process, I mean, democratic deliberation as such being a process, in a Habermasian sense, it is the rational space for arguments back and forth. It can make non-democrats more democratic. So you can think about Navalny himself, who started off as an ardent nationalist, and now we celebrate him with good reason, I think, as a hero of freedom and liberty in Russia and all over the world. And you can also think about Jobbik, for instance, in Hungary, which had been a far-right party on the right of Fidesz, and during democratic deliberation, it became a significantly more democratic political force. And as a result, actually, lost a large part of its electorate because the electorate did not change. So it's a complicated process. The threat is obviously there in the middle.
Okay, let's go with some more. Yes.
Elizabeth Roberts. The question of Serbia, I'm just wondering whether you could say something about where the Orthodox Church sits on this, and whether the Kosovo issue plays into it. I'm thinking quite a lot of what you say, Jessie, about the way in which people can be very united in terms of their opposition to an autocratic regime, but absolutely when it comes, the challenge is really they are successful. Is how that has been the single sort of glue that's kept them together. And actually, you have a whole lot of different views. I happened to come across a whole lot of Serbian students in Slovenia in the summer who were holding a congress there because they were opposed to Vučić and wanted to hold a seminar outside Serbia. But I was very surprised at the positions that some of them took on Kosovo, because we tend to think of people who are opposed to Vučić as liberal, as most people say, but not necessarily so at all. Also, the Orthodox Church, of course, in Montenegro, where you had state capture effectively under Đukanović, played a crucial role in the end in the ousting of Đukanović after 30 years of control in Montenegro, because he unwisely took them on. So perhaps just a little bit about where the Orthodox Church stands and how the Kosovo question plays into it, if it does at all.
Thank you, Elizabeth. We're going to take another 3. Yes.
I'm Sandra Leon, Ramonaref's fellow at the European Study Center. So my question goes for the discussant. Thanks a lot for the comparative overview. That was really useful. So one of the most standard models of accountability in political science is that when governments do not deliver, they are ousted from power. And you mentioned in your discussion that actually these governments are struggling to deliver. So my question is, does it mean that despite eroding institutions, weakening certain institutional rules, checks and balances, these governments might eventually fall and alternation of power happen as it happens in liberal democracy? So there's a bit of a tension there that I would like you to develop. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Yes, Johannes Fühler from the Center for Social Legal Studies. My question is to Zoltán. You categorized the democratic protest in 3 groups, right? And then earlier this year we saw judges in Hungary demonstrating, I think, for the first time meaningfully since Orbán took power. How would you fit those in these categories? Because from what I understand, they're not aligned with the opposition. It would be maybe problematic itself, but then they are maybe apolitical but not powerless. So how do they fit in this?
Okay, and Tim, and then we'll go to the next round.
Thank you for three very interesting presentations. The question of Eric and the question of Zoltán. So Eric, I have vivid memories of walking with the students in Belgrade in 1996-97. They were also showed incredible tenacity. In fact, they greeted me by saying the Czechs only lasted 37 days in the Belgrade Revolution. It was day 109 in Belgrade. Now, my understanding is that Cheddar Jovanovic has come out broadly in support of the protest, but Cheddar Antic, the other leader at that time, has been critical of them. My question is there a very strong sense that we, particularly at Belgrade, the university, other great universities, have this tradition of student protest, as at the Sorbonne, as at Berkeley, as at Peking University, because of the 4th May 1919 protest? Is that an important factor in these demonstrations? And to Zoltán, it's really Jessie's question. Is the Hungarian opposition, particularly Tisza, looking at the problems that Poland in particular has come into? What Stanley Bill and Ben Stanley have called the post-populist trilemma, when you want to be rapid, effective, and legal, but you can only be two of those three. If you're rapid and effective, you're not going to be legal. If you're legal and effective, you're not rapid. Jarosz Kisz calls it the legitimacy and legality dilemma. Is Tisza, which, as we say, has a good chance of winning, trying already to anticipate those difficulties? And if so, what's going to be their answer to it?
Okay, so let's start with Jessie and then the rest. But please bear in mind that the time, because there will be more questions and we need to hear more and more questions. Okay. So.
Thank you so much, Sandra, for the question. So, firstly, what these regimes so far have operated on is what Catherine Stokes has called this kind of perverse accountability. It's the other way around. I think you actually write about it in your book as well. So where it's no longer about the accountability that you deliver, it's more about that the people the parties hold citizens to account. It's the other way around. Parties hold citizens to account by distributing benefits. So what Zoltán was kind of showing is public spending kind of goes up before elections, so buying up votes, etc. But also leveraging threats. And so this is kind of the perverse accountability in which they have operated. But I think exactly what you're saying is kind of happening, that in these kind of semi-authoritarian regimes, or whatever you want to call them, they actually still do operate under the semblance of the same kind of norms, that this perverse accountability is wrong. It shouldn't be working this way. It should be working in the same way as it does in the West, right? Because the West is, until recently, has been seen as normal. And so, which it isn't anymore, right? But this was kind of the rule that people have operated. And so people expect, this is what I've been thinking about, people expect that everything should be happening in the same way that it happens in a normal democratic system. But it doesn't. So essentially, yes. So the regime stops delivering on these services, and this is kind of where the bubble of the propaganda gets pierced, because accountability suddenly starts kicking in as the modus operandi, which it should have in the first place, but it has operated the other way around. But I think the question about threats, where do people stop being worried? Because as Eric was saying, there's actually quite a lot of violence every day. There's something on the media. Some of our colleagues in Niš, Novi Sad, a lot of universities, they haven't been paid for a whole year. I don't even know how they survive, if I'm honest with you, right? So the regime is really trying to suffocate them and starve them as much as it can, and they're still protesting. They're still on it. And the question really is to how long can they hold? And I think SNS is really trying. This is what they told me. We're going to start them out. This is their strategy. It's like a siege, essentially. That's being the strategy right now.
Thanks. Yeah. Eric?
Okay. So yeah, to start with the Serbian Orthodox Church. The Serbian Orthodox Church is a captured institution. That is, it receives tremendous benefits in terms of tax relief, financing, real estate, and so on. And in exchange, it provides unconditional support to the regime in all areas. Yeah, they even overcame some of their ideas about which sexual orientations are the better ones in order to serve the regime. So they're not going anywhere. Having said that, This is the position of the ruling hierarchy of the Serbian Orthodox Church, which has not been supportive. I mean, neither of the student protests nor really of their own students at the Faculty of Theology. But the church is a large and complex institution. I'm not sure that it's the position of every person with a role in the church, particularly because people working in the Orthodox Church, they do have a certain kind of relation to the institution and through that to the regime. But presumably, maybe they also have some sort of relation with God. We don't know. Yeah, in terms of Kosovo, I think it is very, very difficult to be optimistic about any kind of resolution or progress or agreement about Kosovo. It is the line that is most difficult for people to cross. And in Serbia, I think regardless of political affiliation, you'll find very, very large majorities of people who are angry, resentful, and fearful about the position of Serbs in Kosovo, and who believe that they are the object of ethnic cleansing or genocide, and it'll be very difficult to get those people to move. And of course, escalating the situation in Kosovo, where there is already kind of ongoing low-level conflict, is a great tool for Vučić's regime whenever he feels his support weakening. And unfortunately, the government in Kosovo is also weak. So Mr. Kurti, who is now the former prime minister, but hopes to be prime minister again, found, I mean, he lost a lot of his support in states of the European Union by taking these provocative measures that mostly had the effect of making life more difficult for ethnic Serbs in Kosovo. And the public there just loved it. They liked seeing him stick his finger in the eye of Europe. So it worked well for him. He's resorted to the same strategy. I mean, it's possible you could see some change on the Kosovo side, particularly if there are close elections that force Kurti to form a coalition with a more moderate party. It's hard to see a more moderate line developing in Serbia or how it develops. So, sorry, I'm pessimistic there. On the question of university protests, yeah, I think there were only like 2 university professors who were actively opposed to the student protests, and one of them is Chedomir Antić, who you mentioned. So he's basically in the newspapers every day, and they always call him professor. They don't do that with the professors that they don't like. And the other one was a guy from the medical faculty who they made the prime minister. So that's kind of the situation at universities. But is there a tradition of student-based protest? Oh yeah, there is. You know, in the neighborhood where we live in Belgrade, there is a street that used to be called 14th of December Street. It's now been renamed. It's now the street of Tsar Nikolai. You know, the current rulers are big on this, changing these names that I think echo the communist period. And any street that's named after a date, well, it's got to be a communist thing. Not many people know what 14th of December was. 14th of December was a protest by students of the University of Belgrade, at which 4 people were killed in opposition to the German invasion of Poland in 1939. Yeah, that's been erased. It's a long part of the tradition, and certainly the case in '96 when you were there. I think what these protests may have in common with the protests in 1999 is that, I mean, universities and students are often the core of the protests and their great strength. Their great weaknesses, this means that they're based in urban populations and in the middle class. These are the 2 times that you've seen them really reaching beyond that. So now you have protests, I mean, not only among students and other professionals, but in smaller towns among people with different levels of education. So this is an encouraging sign. Sorry, I went on too hard.
Okay, no, that's fine. Okay, so question number 1: how about the judges' protest? And it's a super interesting case. Of course, it's not usual that judges are protesting. I would characterize it as apolitical. So you're perfectly right that we are not powerless. But actually, apolitical protesters are not necessarily powerful. I admit that the judges are particularly powerful in an institutional sense, but actually, students or teachers can be powerful as well. many ways. So apolitical in my vocabulary doesn't mean that you are powerless. It means that you do not have yourself an ambition to have power. You are not forming a political party or any other organization to contest the elections and become the power holder entity. And in that sense, judges are part of the apolitical resistance movement in that particular moment you are referring to. But it's a very interesting question. Thanks a lot. With respect to this legitimacy legality dilemma, I think one can fairly claim that Tisza and Peter Magyar is he's a populist, and as such, he's not particularly interested in legality. He's interested in legitimacy and generating legitimacy in a populist way, and he's not going to be too much concerned if they are breaching some legal thresholds or institutional integrity being undermined by his government. It's going to be decided in the moment, depending on political circumstances. Legality itself doesn't for them, which has, it is part of the danger they constitute for liberal democracy in Hungary. I believe a Tisza victory would constitute, an overwhelming Tisza victory certainly would constitute dangers for liberal democracy. Actually, that if he was sitting here, I think his response would be, we don't have that problem because we will receive 2/3 majority in parliament, and then we will be dealing with all sorts of institutional issues with our 2/3 constitutional majority. But that would be also very dangerous.
Okay. Yes, you have to.
Thanks. So you have described very well the electoral sort of the traits of this electoral authoritarian regime. So at the same time, you kind of argue that the opposition has a chance. So I guess my question is, how ready do you think that the regimes are to accept defeat and provide a smooth transition of power? And then more specifically, so it's also been described how, I mean, basically you have here two opposition movements that are recent, they have little institutionalization, but at the same time, you have described two regimes that have a strong control over the state apparatus and that through networks or patrimonialization. So basically, how much can this opposition, if they reach power, deliver when the state apparatus won't disappear overnight, will still be controlled, I guess, by, there will be an inertia from the previous regime.
Okay. Michael?
Yeah, Michael, professor here of European politics. I have a question for Zoltán. So I remember the enthusiasm in 2021 as well when the United Opposition was doing the polls, and in the end, the Fidesz regime was able to mobilize much better than that. So I was wondering, so given the amount of gerrymandering that is already in place, the compensation of winners, that's also a unique feature that probably also benefits Fidesz. So I think it would be very, very close, right? And with such a close contest, one would sort of think that vote wasting would matter quite a lot. So what are the other opposition parties doing? I know Momentum is not running again, but how about DK and this joke party? So what are their thoughts and how do you see this?
Yes, Peter.
It was very interesting to hear in both examples that so much of the opposition movement is defined by not being the government in the sense, defined by being anti versus being for anything specifically. Obviously, this is not unique to illiberal governments. We can see here in the UK and some of the trends, that's very common. But I suppose my question to you is, looking back, are there better examples or drivers that you see that can push us more towards a positive view or a positive movement of revolution against anti-liberals? Or is this the norm that always needs to happen to get enough to overcome it?
All right. Okay, and Paul.
Thank you very much. I'll return to something that Jessie said, which links these two papers, and that's a very kind of close and dependent relation on Russia. How does that Russian dependence play out among kind of resistance circles? Imagine there's some that are pro, against, but that changing image of Russia and its attitude toward Russia? Is that a rallying point for resistance?
Okay, and let me squeeze my question because I don't know whether I'm Zoltán, right? Why do you think if the EU is, really corners Orban to such an extent economically, why doesn't he change the tune? I mean, Meloni does it. Others do it as well. Why is Orban so insistent on playing the United States card and being the liberal and the odd one out in Europe? Okay. Let's start with Eric this time.
Okay. So let me see. First to the question, will authoritarian regimes accept defeat? Let me put it this way. The term deep state has kind of come into disrepute recently because of the way in which it's been used in politics. But when the term was developed by political scientists, they were really working around an insight that parties in power don't necessarily represent only themselves. I mean, the term deep state was developed to answer the question, why is it that in states like Pakistan or Egypt, you have changes of political control, right? The military leaves power and an elected government comes in, but nothing changes. And they say, well, that's because the governments are not really exercising power. There's something behind that is actually exercising the power. And I think that is certainly the case in Serbia, where a long series of governments have really been representatives of a coalition of some economic interests and the security services. And the time when they leave power is when it becomes clear that this coalition is no longer going to support them. So I think that's the moment when you'll see them admitting defeat, is when they're no longer able to rely on those institutions that give them force and authority to support them. And to the question of positive outcomes, I mean, I don't know, Peter. I mean, what will lead to a positive outcome? I mean, if I knew, I would be telling everybody. But I will say this: that you hear a lot of people in opposition circles talking about the need for this broad coalition to not exclude anybody. Just get the regime out of power, and then it's possible to begin things. And I think that people have really been burned by that strategy before. When a lot of people, in order to get rid of Milosevic, accepted Koštunica, who then ended up gathering the same, can I use the term deep state, backing that Milosevic had around him before. So this broad coalition means that you bring people into power who are going to cause a problem for you. And I would hate to see that mistake repeated. And maybe I can just say quickly about Russia. I'm not sure that Russia plays a very big role in this, although they'd certainly like to. They're probably helping with propaganda. Generally speaking, I think the role of Russia in Southeast Europe is overstated. It's a place where they can cause problems for Europe at very low risk and at a very low price. And Russia is sometimes attractive to some people because of their frustration with, particularly, I mean, as Jessie mentioned, things like this EU-sponsored lithium mining project, which would destroy the most productive agricultural land in Serbia, among other things. So Russia is more there as kind of something filling the category of not Europe, not the West, than is representing anything in particular. Having said that, many very engaged and well-informed people will disagree very vehemently with everything I just said, and think that Russia's hands are really everywhere. But I'm not sure that I can represent their points of view because they're not mine.
Okay, so following up on Russia, I think ideologically speaking, Russia, the friendship towards Russia is one of the major weaknesses of the regime. Russia traditionally is not particularly seen as a friendly power, although the regime did a great job in transforming public perception. So if you look at opinion polls, that you will see that Russia's popularity and acceptance has dramatically risen the past 10 to 15 years, along with actually China, and along with the decline of the US, and to some extent also Western Europe, to a lesser extent also Western Europe. So the regime did a good job at that, which is quite surprising, but still, nevertheless, claiming that the Ukrainians should give up and should give in to Russia, and it's insane what they are doing. Basically, the government says that it's still not very popular. So it still constitutes a rallying point for the opposition. And actually, Russia is present in many ways in Hungary. So to some extent, I think I disagree with Gordy, because there is substantial economic interest, economic presence, and there's a very massive presence of Russia in Hungary, and mass public communication. So you see the patterns of Russian propaganda recurringly in Hungarian pro-government propaganda. So it's not very difficult to detect the presence both ideologically and economically of Russia in Hungary. So obviously there are very substantial interests on both the side of the regime and Russia. And if you think about Trump suggesting peace negotiations between Putin and Zelensky in Budapest, obviously it has to do with the intention of strengthening Orbán through this international support. I would say the network of the alliance of international authorities. So I think there are interests and materially, politically, and other. Regarding the enthusiasm of 2021 and the current situation, it's super interesting why the united opposition failed, and to some extent it's a collective action problem. Of course, you establish collective action and among relatively weak players, you suffer a blow at the election, that the entire thing falls apart, and the whole effort becomes illegitimate in the eyes of voters. Of course, these parties acted quite stupidly, I think, after the election. Instead of sticking together, they themselves started to competing against each other at the cost of their own at the end of the day. So it's, in retrospect, it's not very surprising that another player comes around and grabs basically all the opposition vote. It's interesting how rationally the public acted in some sense, because now the opposition public, which is now the majority of the Hungarian public in my assessment, rallies around a single person, a single populist, with all the dangers included and involved in that scenario. Whether or not the two-tailed duck party and the Democratic Coalition and the fragments of liberals should stand elections or not, I mean, opinions are divided. One argument is what you are sort of suggesting, that every vote counts. And the other is, which actually happens to be mine, that there's nothing more dangerous than the lack of democracy among Democrats. So I would be very, very concerned about the scenario in which Peter Magyar and his party remains to be the sole democratic, nominally at least democratic force. Why the EU corners so much Orbán? So I think and of course I don't want to fall into the trap of being a proud Hungarian who is kind of over valuing the importance of Viktor Orbán. But actually, I think it's not usual that the prime minister of a modest country in Central Europe goes to the world stage. So I think he did a fairly impressive job in that context in the past 15 years. And for a while, he was not that much appreciated. Obviously, he made his bets, for instance, in Trump, which seems to be paying off for him. And he also made his bets with respect to the European far right against Angela Merkel, when Angela Merkel was probably the most powerful politician in Europe. and that also seems to be paid off. And I think the majority of the EU has a good reason to try and put it back. And it's probably a little bit too late, I would say. So I think it's rational to try and to corner Orbán, but it's going to be more and more difficult with Babiš coming to power and so joining the Patriots. So it's going to be tough. Why Orbán doesn't change tone? Well, I think he doesn't like to change tone. First of all, and I think he still keeps the same bets. And to be honest, in domestic politics, it's paying off. Being the nationalist, sovereignist hero standing up against the EU and against all the pressure he suffers.
Thank you. And Jessie, the final word, but I would like to add something for you as well. If you want to widen the sample a little bit, let's take in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Is Dodik, Republika Srpska, sandwiched between Serbia and Hungary and of a similar kind of illiberal orientation? Is there some kind of a hope there? The fact that he is sidelined from the frontline politics, that we are seeing a little bit of a resistance to illiberalism there as well, and you being a Czech and formerly a Czechoslovak. How do you see Babiš on the one hand? What type of illiberalism do we see there grown? And then whether there's going to be any kind of resistance, democratic opposition to feature in Slovakia?
Thanks.
To finish on the comparative side.
2 minutes. Okay. I just really want to say first on Russia. So I think the situation is slightly different in Hungary and Serbia. I still think that energy plays a big role. Really, energy is the key. And I think a lot of the deals that we don't really necessarily know that are being made in Moscow is that we know that Serbia and Hungary have been receiving cheaper energy than anywhere else, pretty much. Not hugely cheaper, but it's kind of paid off from that economic perspective as well. I agree with the kind of the propaganda that has been built around Russia in the Balkans. It's more true for sure in Republika Srpska than it is, for example, in Serbia. It has been overblown, but I think that part of the narrative is not so much about Russia per se, but it's about being anti-West. It's about having that position. If you're not pro-Western, that you have to be anti-Western, hence you need to be pro-Russian, essentially, or you are pro-Russian. And I think in Hungary, there's also this, and Orbán has really tried this with this anti-Ukrainian kind of stream. He, famously in 2022, he also came up with this claim that after all, in 1956, it was mostly Ukrainian soldiers, that crushed the uprising. So he really tried to do as much narrative gymnastics as he could with the anti-Ukrainian stream there. About the broad movements, sometimes potentially that is the only, I think right now, these regimes have been now in power, one since 2010, the other one since 2012-ish. I think it's now seen as this is too long, institutions are too entrenched, at least we need to get them out and then we figure out the rest. It's a dangerous strategy for a variety of reasons that we've discussed, but potentially that is the only strategy that there is right now, because unless the opposition is somehow brought together under whatever labels, I don't necessarily see how they're going to create coalition politics, especially not in Hungary, which just operates under such a strange electoral system. I also wanted to say about what Eric was saying about the transition of these people. So, we talk a lot about transitional justice in the former Yugoslavia, but we rarely talk about vetting and illustrations. And this is something that Serbia really could have used at least a little bit of, because we really do see a continuation of these guards that have been in power, special security, that have been in power since the 1990s. Okay, Dodik. So really interesting situation in Bosnia right now. We don't necessarily know, so the elections definitely were rigged. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But we don't necessarily know what the electoral committee is going to rule in the end, to what degree they were rigged, and whether in these Laktashi and these other municipalities, whether they will have to be repeated or not. Because it's razor tight between, not Dodik, sorry. So Dodik wasn't able to run, but it was, he basically appointed a man and then who was running against the opposition, the main opposition party, really called the Serbian Democratic Party. They're not democratic, but it doesn't matter, another nationalist party. But it's razor tight, and so we don't necessarily know. But I think the Bosnian case is really interesting. We don't have time for that, but it's a really interesting case of where They've tried everything. They've tried protests. They've tried opposition parties. They've tried all these resistance routes. Nothing worked because the system of Bosnia is so complex. So then it's the constitutional court. So then it's judiciary. So then it's making sure that at least they get them out, which is what worked with the ICTY, getting these people out of the system through the kind of legal judicial way. And Dodik is really cornered. He's weak. He's completely basically lost popularity in Banja Luka, the capital of Republika Srpska. So to a certain degree, I mean, stakes are still out. We don't really know, but to a certain degree, it has worked at least a little bit. Babiš, okay, Babiš, we still don't know whether he's going to be appointed, by the way, because his conflict of interest has not been resolved, and the president is very persistent that he will not let go on this particular point. So we don't actually really know whether he's going to be appointed as a prime minister. If he is, I'm not worried about Babiš. I'm worried about his coalition partners, who are a pretty awful, toxic masculinity, you name it, everything's in the government right now. Wife beaters, girlfriend rapers, everything's going to be part of the government. So I'm not that worried about Babiš. I'm worried about, actually, I prefer him to be the prime minister because at least he can rein them in a little bit. Because we can already see what's happening now. He's really struggling to rein them in. He's controlling them in the media because they're saying some pretty awful things. Fico, oh my God, where do we even start with that? So obviously Fico has been emboldened by the assassination attempt, and he's I think that has radicalized him in many respects as well. But the progressives are really rising in the opinion polls. They really have a good chance because for all of these reasons that we've discussed tonight, Slovakia is not doing well, mostly for economic reasons, but also stability, security. Although Slovakians are more pro-Russian, if you like, than the Czechs, there is quite a lot of grievances regarding kind of the geopolitical pivoting of Slovakia as well. And the progressives really are, for the first time, doing pretty well in the polls. So there is hope there, I think. But Fico will fight stronger than he ever has because he has been radicalized through.
Okay, and thank you so much for all three of you. I mean, I'm leaving the room with a little bit of hope that there is some resistance to illiberalism in Central European countries, when in Western European countries we are actually seeing the opposite route. You can never make sense of how Europe is doing, But it's been terrific having all three of you with so much information, richness, excellent comparative points. We learned a lot, and please join me in thanking our speakers.